Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, is that robot ethical? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone, welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week's episode is about the ethical issues that can arise when we bring robots into our homes, and how roboticists can identify those risks to help them design more ethical robots. But first, I'd like to remind you to rate this episode and leave a review if that's something you can do on the platform you're listening on. And don't forget to share the podcast on social media or tell your friends about it. It really helps the podcast reach more listeners. So, with all that said, let's get on with this week's interview. I recently had a fascinating discussion with Catherine Menon from the University of Hertfordshire about designing home assistance robots with ethics in mind. Today, I'm speaking to Catherine Menon, a principal lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire, whose work focuses on the ethics and safety of autonomous systems. Hi Catherine, welcome to Robot Talk.
Hi Claire, thank you for having me.
So, first of all, can you give us a little bit of an overview of your current research on robotics and autonomous systems?
Yes, of course. So my current work is exploring the intersection of ethics and safety in public-facing AI systems. So those are systems where the general public will use them as opposed to people with any specialized training. And within that, I'm particularly interested in assistive robots. And those are robots that are intended to live, for want of a better word, in someone's house. So they're typically to help people with activities of daily living. So they might provide some social companionship. They might provide things that we call re-ablement functions, which assist people in carrying out activities themselves. So those functions could include anything from reminding a user to take daily medication, to answering the doorbell for a user, to perhaps coaching them through some specific physical activity, or even offering to set up a video call so they can chat with their family or their friends. And I'm particularly interested in the ethical hazards that these systems present. So most people are familiar with safety hazards, the idea that the robot might accidentally collide with you or something like that. But there's much less awareness of ethical hazards. And it's particularly hard with ethics because ethical hazards present differently across different demographics and different cultures. So in other words, the ethical hazards that an assistive robot might present to me are not going to be the same as the ones it would present to you or to anyone else.
Yeah.
And this is particularly relevant when the users aren't involved with the developments of these systems. So in other words, when as designers, we haven't sought adequate input from users. And unfortunately, the demographics that might benefit most from assistive robots are not really overlapping with the demographics of what we call early adopters, so the people who are most likely to be involved in development or assessment of prototypes of these.
Yeah.
So what I've been working on are different methodologies to assess the ethical hazards that are presented by a specific system, like an individual assistive robot. And to come up with reproducible and effective ways of not only identifying those hazards across different demographics, but also mitigating them.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess these robots that interact with people in their home or perhaps in a care home environment are presumably going to present the most possible ethical hazards because they're part of your daily life, they're there all the time. It's more than just a fleeting interaction.
Yes, absolutely. So they're within your private space. They're involved in your daily activities. They're meeting your family. They're involved in every aspect of your life. And so the ethical hazards that you might identify for a workplace robot, for example, are all present in terms of compromise of privacy, for example. But you have that added dimension of what you might expect within your house, within your home, being really different and much more liable to ethical compromise than what you might expect within a workplace.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you mentioned how the ethical hazards differ from person to person. When you're studying this, how fine-grained can you get with that? Because there's an almost infinite variety of different people, but obviously you can't interview every single person on the planet. It's not feasible. So how fine-grained do you go with that kind of analysis?
Yes, absolutely. That is the $4,000 question. So what we do tend to do is try and identify different demographics. So I've worked, for example, with school children as a specific demographic because children are particularly vulnerable to certain ethical hazards, including hazards such as persuasion or compromise of human autonomy in ways which adults aren't. So we found that the best way to proceed is to identify different demographics and try and work very collaboratively within workshops. So I try and lead participant-led workshops. So workshops where the participants are free to direct the conversation. I try to make it a relatively safe space, which I think you don't always get in discussions of technology, where, for example, the participants are able to identify, this is my particular home environment. These are the factors with which I have to contend there. And here is an ethical hazard that I think I would be presented with.
Yeah.
And what our job as developers is then to go away and extrapolate from that. So from the information about the participants' backgrounds, we can then extrapolate and say, well, okay, if something were slightly different, would that now present a completely new ethical hazard? So it's a very controlled process. It's almost quite rigorous as a process, although it sounds very free-flowing from the participant's perspective, because you really do need to go and, in a very structured way, identify what each of these variables might be to make sure that you've addressed as many of the ethical hazards as you can.
Yeah. Trust in robots is something that's come up quite a lot on the podcast. How do you think that, applying ethical principles or safety regulations influences people's trust, particularly in these kind of public-facing robots that you mentioned?
I think it's a really difficult question. So systems which fall under very rigorous regulatory regimes, such as defense systems or nuclear systems, obviously have a lot of checks and balances inherent in the development of them, which can reinforce people's trust. But other systems, ones like assistive robots, which don't have that same rigor of legislative requirements around their developments, have much less of that backing to reassure people. However, I do also think there's something to be said for the counterpoint, that although a lot of existing standards do address specific system characteristics like safety, like security, like robustness or reliability, they're not exactly bedtime reading for a lot of end users. So what the situation tends to be is that there's actually relatively little public awareness of the role of standards and the part that standards play in helping to assure these systems, but also the fact that a standards compliant system is not necessarily guaranteed to be safe or to be ethical. And in particular, when we start talking about trusting these systems that are in our house and interacting with us in daily life, I think people are justified in saying, well, actually, it would take me more than knowing that this was built to some standard to really help me trust that AI-informed system. I think there's work we have to do as developers there on the human interaction side, rather than simply showing a certification or saying this was developed to a particular standard. and expecting that to necessarily influence the way it's received by the end user.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like, I mean, for most people, like you said, I'm not reading safety regulations, but what I am doing is reading the newspaper and watching films. And a lot of that is quite negative, especially when it comes to robotics.
Yes, there's a huge issue actually around the type of narratives that we propagate when we talk about robotics, when we talk about AI systems, which is another aspect of work that I'm looking at, which is how do we tell these stories about them? And in telling these stories, how do we steer development towards one or other of these endpoints? So as humans, we're very story-driven animals, we're very story-driven creatures. And I think not only do those stories affect the end user, but they affect the developers who use them subconsciously to come up with ideas, with features, with strategic directions for their systems. And unfortunately, as you said, there is at the moment a very strong narrative of existential risk posed by robots, the idea that robots are going to come and take our jobs, going to come and cause us harm. And I think that narrative does feed into a distinct lack of trust in systems like assistive robots.
Yeah, I don't know how we address that problem.
No, very much above my pay grade.
So we have an audience question from Ethan on Twitter who says, what are the most pressing ethical concerns in robotics today? So quite a big question.
Yes, this is a fantastic question. Thank you, Ethan. I'd say the most pressing concern, if I had to pick one, would be the need for transparency. So there's two forms of transparency that you can talk about when you talk about designing an AI system, a robotic system. So the first is what we call design transparency. So this is transparency actually into the design process so that the end user can be assured that the developer, the designer of the robot, has followed procedures which are fair, which are robust, which are diverse, which are secure in the development of the robot. And then there's also what we call algorithmic transparency. And algorithmic transparency is the property of ensuring that the end user, the person actually using the robot, can understand why the robot has come to the conclusions which it has, for example.
Yeah.
And this is particularly important for ethics in a way which it's not for safety. Because for ethics, unlike safety, unlike security, unlike practically every other system property that you could name, there's no difference between insurance and assurance. So in terms of safety, I can ensure a system is safe, following certain procedures, using certain development techniques. And then even if I lose all the evidence that I've followed those processes, that I've conducted those peer reviews, that I've conducted that formal verification, that doesn't make the system unsafe. So I might not be able to prove it's safe, but it doesn't mean it's going to hurt you. So in other words, safety is a system property that doesn't care if you believe in it.
Yeah.
But ethics is different. So with ethics, if I believe that I'm being discriminated against by an AI-informed system, then that is potentially ethical harm in itself, regardless of whether or not it has. And the reason for this is that the demographics in our society that have historically been marginalized the most by technology, so for example, people from diverse educational backgrounds or people living with frailty, for example, which is very relevant for assistive robots, are those people, again, who are less likely to inherently reach out to adopt these new systems and these new technologies, which understandably they say, well, this might further marginalize me. I don't believe this is built for me. But as a result, on a societal level, those technologies, or rather the benefits of those technologies, become concentrated on the other demographics, and the issues of bias or fairness or unfairness, rather, and lack of adequate representation persist within those systems. And all because as developers, as researchers, we didn't do enough to reach out to those demographics and assure them that the systems were ethical. So I would definitely say transparency would have to be my major concern when it comes to AI-enabled systems.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I guess when you're talking about systems that are being developed commercially, it feels like the companies don't really want to be transparent. You know, they want to protect their intellectual property. And so there's a bit of a conflict there.
Yes, absolutely. There's the commercial driver as opposed to the ethical driver. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, there is very little at the moment in terms of a regulatory regime to require companies to consider ethics. Yeah. So a lot of companies do sign up to voluntary ethics compliance, for example, and there are several very good ethical standards out there, but unlike safety, there's no legislative requirement for most of these systems to start considering that. So you do inevitably always have this competition between two desirable principles for those companies.
So what design principles can be used to kind of protect against the ethical hazards that might occur when designing, intelligent technologies like robots?
So apart from transparency, which I said is one of the big ones, another effective design principle is diversity in design. And that can be everything from physical design. So, for example, when we talk about an assistive robot, it can include the specific look and feel of that robot, which may engender trust within certain people. So, for example, you have robots which mimic the appearance of a child, which mimic the appearance of a pet, for example.
Yeah.
And that will vary across different ages and cultures again. Down to things like diversity of the hardware and software components that actually make up the system, so that you can avoid things like single points of failure. Because once a robot has failed once, as we've mentioned before, that becomes embedded in the narrative, the public narrative around that robot. Explainability is also a really important principle to embed within technology like an assistive robot. So I've touched on this before when I identified the importance of algorithmic transparency. But explainability goes beyond that to thinking about how do you actually construct a human understandable explanation
exactly, yeah.
of why the robot did or didn't do something. So often we'll find that a robot refuses to take a particular action, refuses to act on a certain command because it would violate a certain embedded property within its programming. So something like a functional requirement, a timing property, an accuracy specification, which is needed in order to make sure that that robot can remain safe.
Yeah.
However, what you can't do is spit that explanation out to an end user. An end user wants a human readable, a human understandable explanation of why the robot didn't do it and a justification for that. So what we definitely don't want to be moving towards is this idea of computer says no, or I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. There's a reason that those are cliches. And it's something that I think as developers, we need to make sure that we almost treat as teachable moments when we start developing these systems.
Do you see large language models as a potential solution for turning the computer jargon explanation into something people can understand?
Oh, no, that's an interesting question. I think they can go a certain way towards doing it. So the technical capability of large language models is unparalleled. I will say that. And the computing power, the power that's available to anyone who can open a web browser and go to ChatGPT is phenomenal.
Yeah.
But where I think we run into ethical and potentially safety hazards is the propensity for those systems to hallucinate.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
what we really need to avoid is creating an assistive robot that lies to us.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
obviously giving a false report is a significant issue, it's a significant ethical issue. But as I said before, these things are devices, our systems, which will live in our houses, which we will entrust with a lot of our daily, our intimate lives. And the idea that we have invited one of those systems in that is, to put it in the most scaremongering terms, that is out of touch with reality and will lie to us if it can't identify what it ought to be saying, is really quite a frightening concept, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I have some pretty substantial concerns with large language models, but I do think that there's some useful applications of them as well.
Yes, I think one of the problems with them as well is paradoxically that they are so powerful. So if you ask ChatGPT a question, you will get an answer back immediately because of how the system works. Whereas if you ask a human a question, they will think about it, they'll give you a nuanced answer, they might change their minds. And what that allows us to do is to adjust to each other's tempo of decision making. Whereas if you are presented with the solution immediately, there's a certain ethical pressure on you to accept that solution rather than to sit with it, rather than to make your own mind up in time, because the little cursor is blinking there and you're not being given that very human space.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So there's an interesting debate that I've been kind of having with some of my friends and my partner about this often comes up in relation to autonomous vehicles, but I think it probably applies more broadly than that, about the ability of these systems to make ethical decisions on their own. And kind of one side of the debate is, well, you know, if we're talking about a decision that could harm a person, it should always be a human making that decision, versus the other side kind of saying, well, okay, but AI systems can be less prone to errors, can be less prone to mistakes or crashes in the case of autonomous vehicles, so it's better for them to make the decision. Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer here. I think it's an interesting conversation. What are your thoughts on this debate, and how do you think that we can kind of proceed towards making these decisions as a society?
So I think it's a really interesting and nuanced question, because it's one of those questions where we can't make decisions individually. It has to be on a societal level. You can't expect to take an autonomous vehicle out on the road and not have that affect the other road users, for example.
Exactly, yeah.
And to a certain extent, it depends on the type of system, because the calculus is different for different types of systems. So if we take an autonomous vehicle, a self-driving car, these are systems which are not intended to cause any physical harm to anyone. So nobody creates a self-driving car that's intended to cause harm to a road user, that is equipped in any way to make a decision about whether to cause harm today or to not cause harm today. So the way the question manifests when we talk about autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars is something like the trolley problem, where the system is not deciding, do I cause harm or not? But it's essentially, the question becomes, who do I cause harm to? And the trolley problem is very accessible. And it's a great way to get people to start thinking about these ethical decisions and who should make them. But for these types of systems, I think it focuses our attention on the wrong place. Okay. So it's a starting point, not a stopping point for the debate. So instead of asking what the vehicle should do in that situation, if it should, for example, give control back to the driver to make that decision, or if it should decide based on some calculus about whose life is worth more, what we really ought to be doing is identifying how the autonomy of that system could avoid getting into that situation to begin with. How could it help us as a driver-system pairing to avoid those situations where harm is going to be caused? And what we emphatically don't want is a solution where the AI can get itself and the driver into that system and then without warning say, this is a tricky ethical decision, and throw it back on the driver without any warning, any indication. Unfortunately, this is the solution that's proposed at SAE level 3, which is one of the levels of autonomous driving, between basically driver assistance like lane keep assist and full autonomy, where the driver is the fallback if the vehicle gets into a situation that it can't handle. And that places a significant burden on the driver because as humans, we're not equipped to monitor a situation where we're not being involved in the same way. So when we're not physically doing the driving ourselves, our attention is going to be less engaged with the road and we've got less situational awareness. So the idea of looping the human back into the decision when it's too late for them to be able to do anything about it is also ethically unacceptable. So in other words, we need to be looking at how the AI has already failed to get into that situation to begin with, and how can we use autonomy for things like additional situational awareness or surveillance or object recognition or route planning or any other aspect of driving to avoid that. Now, for other systems, it's a different calculus. So, for example, for something like robot-assisted surgery, the intent there is to cause some harm in order to achieve a greater good. So, for example, cutting away some cancerous tissue in order to make the patient healthy again. So in this case, it's quite a specialized decision. So it has to take into account the specific capabilities of the robot, including error margins, the patient's circumstance, the measure of the, supposing it's successful, resultant increased extent and quality of human life. And the medical profession actually do use an actual metric, quality of human life years. And above all, I think it's important for these sorts of systems to take into account the surgeon and the patient's risk tolerance. So the crucial question there is one of consent. Does the patient consent to the robot taking any of that decision themselves? Or do they want to, for example, opt out and say, I would like this decision to be made by a human? And finally, although I don't work on them, it is worth just mentioning the third category, the category that always lurks in the background, which is lethal autonomous weapons systems. So systems which are designed with a military purpose in mind. In other words, the intention is to cause some degree of harm to the intended target. So for these systems, the position of the International Committee of the Red Cross is very, very clear. So while they will accept autonomous systems being used as decision support systems, so identifying the best logistics for a brigade to take, the best route, that sort of thing, the Red Cross state that these AI systems should never, ever be in command about whether or not to attack a target. So to do so, they state, would be to compromise human dignity because lives are at stake. The system is designed, let's face it, to cause that harm. Letting the system take that decision is reducing the potential targets of the attack to nothing more than objects in a machine's calculations. So in other words, it's a compromise of a fundamental human right, which is that of dignity. So I've given a very, very complex answer to that question. I'm sorry.
It was a complex question, so that's fine.
Which is the very evasive answer of it. It really depends on the system. It depends on how you've got yourself into that position to begin with. It depends on the ethical tolerance, on the acceptance, on the awareness of the public that there is even an ethical decision to make. And it also depends on the technical capabilities of the system to make them itself. So yes, unfortunately, not a simple answer.
No. Do these kind of questions come up with relation to like assistive robots in the home? I'm trying to think. Obviously, they definitely fall into the category of robots designed to not harm anyone. I can't think of an example, but my sense is that there would be similar kinds of conundrums that might apply.
There definitely are. So there are things where there's some sort of ethical trade-off, for example. So if an assistive robot, which has some health monitoring capability, identifies that some aspect of the end user's health is potentially of concern, perhaps they aren't moving very much, perhaps in monitoring you've noticed that their blood pressure is rising or dropping, there's the debate about whether or not the system should decide to tell someone about that. So on the one hand, you have the question of integrity and privacy of medical data. If the user hasn't given permission for that, can the system override it? And on the other hand, you have the question of whether or not this system really ought to be equipped to make those life or death decisions, because if it doesn't alert someone and the user deteriorates in health, then you've potentially implicated the system in that. And I think the worrying thing is that these systems will be put into those scenarios without a full understanding of whether or not they are ethically able to make those decisions, and also whether the end user has given their consent to this system making those decisions, or even really understands that they are. I mean, there's the daft question, but how often do you read the manual that comes with the latest kitchen appliance, for example? I certainly don't. And if you received a couple of inches thick manual with your assistive robot, how many people are going to read all the small print and understand what the implications are about what it'll do in any given scenario? We can't expect end users to do that.
No. And if you give them a series of checkboxes to say, yes, I agree to this, no, I don't agree to that, they're not, I wouldn't probably read those either.
No, absolutely not.
If there was more than like 4 of them.
Yes, I would just, yes, let me start.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated one. There aren't easy answers to these questions, but it's an interesting conversation to have.
Yes, it's. I think it's really interesting. I think it's it kind of goes back to a lot of I think what people don't expect to see within robotics. So people often think that robotics is about sitting in front of a lab bench or a computer with a soldering iron in your hand or in front of a blinking monitor. And certainly you can do that. But a lot of robotics is about creativity. If you ask an end user, what would you like your robot to do? They don't come with a list of functional and non-functional requirements. They come with a story about how they would like their world to look with the assistive robot in it. And that's a story about how they want to interact with it, what kind of life they would like to have with it, what kind of person they would like to be, what kind of society would they expect to live in. So it's really, again, all down to stories. So when we create these robots, we're creating devices, systems that are going to become part of the end user's narrative, so part of their lives, integrated into their lives, and part of their story. So I would say, when you come down to it, robotics is all stories, really.
Yeah, I like that way of looking at it. Catherine, it's been fun talking to you today. I've been chatting to Catherine Menon from the University of Hertfordshire. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review. It really helps boost the podcast, so thanks in advance. And don't forget to join the Robot Talk community on Patreon if you'd like to support the podcast and get access to some awesome perks, including behind-the-scenes updates and monthly bonus episodes. Visit patreon.com/Claire Asher to find out more. Next week, I'll be chatting to Patrick Meyer from the Climate Robotics Network about robots for climate action. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.